They thought time was on their side. They thought distance, deniability, and the polite paralysis of diplomacy would blunt humanity's rage. They watched a human leader fall at a peace table and believed we would drown in grief, in process, in committees. They forgot what our historians carved into the stone of old cities and newer stars alike. Humans count their dead, then we count the hours. 72:00:00, and the Orion summit hall still rang with the echo of a single shot that had no muzzle flash, no visible path, and no author. Only the quiet collapse of a woman who had carried a continent's storms in her eyes and a planet's compromises in her lungs. "You started the clock," Admiral Sarah Chen whispered, and the room understood she did not mean a clock that measured time. She meant a doctrine. The Orion summit convened in a cathedral of glass and fielded gravity, hovering above an amber gas giant whose bands rolled like sleeping tigers. Delegations arrived in colors and creeds, banners and badges. Earth came in low color and tighter badges, quiet cloth and clean lines, because the first principle of peace is humility. The second is vigilance. President Miriam Solace hated podiums. She insisted they were barriers disguised as platforms. So she stood level with ambassadors and envoys, her voice a warm instrument tuned to disarm and to assemble. She spoke of old Earth cities reborn from floodplains and fault lines, of the Mercator Reef, rescued by schoolchildren's political stubbornness, of the Pacific Grid, a light lattice made not by generals but by linemen and programmers and a million patient hands. She spoke of treaties written in small print and engines engineered with fail-safes for strangers' lives. And then she stumbled. It was, at first, so ordinary, perhaps a stutter in the gravity field, perhaps the fatigue of a woman who had negotiated until dawn. Her fingers splayed on the transparent lectern. Someone laughed, one of those nervous social laughs that humans are cursed with. The laugh died before it finished because Miriam's breath did. Admiral Chen was moving before the bodyguards. The Admiral didn't remember the movement later, only the fact of her shoulders striking marble, a hand under a chin that no longer fought to rise, and the way the President's eyes found hers for the last fraction of a second. Not terror, not surprise, a ledger balanced, a promise assigned. The medical lattice flowered out of the floor in white petals and immaculate tubes. It tried because trying is the third principle of peace. The lattice failed because somewhere in the gold leaf geometry of the summit hall, justice had already been insulted. On every wall, in every ornament, in 100 invisible seams, the summit's carefully curated aesthetics tried to hold. The star-forged chandeliers kept their glow. The oxygen balanced itself like a trained dancer. The gravity did not quiver. Protocols did what protocols do. Sealed doors, quarantined toxins, partitioned air, summoned tribunals. Ambassador Elena Vasquez, Earth's only voice the crowd could still hear, spoke without looking down. "This is a crime scene," she said, her Spanish accent softened but not erased by years of universal translators. "No one moves." The Vyerk's Dominion's envoy, tall, scarred, with the patient condescension of old empires, lifted both hands like a supplicant, eyes wide with the mimicry of concern. "We grieve with you," he said. "Let us be of assistance." "We will accept your assistance," Vasquez replied, "in exactly 72 hours. Admiral Chen looked up at the vaulting glass sky, at the procession of shuttles that had brought the galaxy's polite machinery to Orion. Her personal HUD didn't flicker. It did one new thing. It began to count. 72:00:00. In the corner of her eye, the numerals were the same color as the blood she had wiped off her palm. She felt the doctrine settle on her shoulders. Not vengeance, never that word in the human tongue. Restitution, containment, disassembly. The words our lawyers had grafted to our generals and our philosophers had spliced to our engineers. On the summit floor, the med lattice cooled to a shroud. The glass cathedral hummed. The galaxy waited for us to break. We did what our ancestors taught us. We broke down the event. The archivist woke, not a single mind. A covenant of minds, the quiet chorus of a million devices Earth had scattered like breadcrumbs across every hall, dock, corridor, and badge. Passive sensors became witnesses. Witnesses became affidavits. The affidavits braided themselves into a chain of custody so tight that later, when the tribunal tried to pry it open with politics, it held like gravity. No muzzle flash because there had been no barrel. No projectile path because there had been no projectile. The archivist rendered the impossible. A phase-skipped singular pulse, shaped like a sigh, guided by a contract brokered in the Viurks under markets, paid for through 6 shells and 2 charities, fired from somewhere that wasn't aware. The pulse found Miriam solace because her heart was calibrated to a pacemaker made on New Kowloon by a subcontractor owned by an investment trust, controlled by a Viurk's cousin. The pacemaker received a whisper from a distance and obeyed an instruction never written in it. There was deniability. There is always deniability. The archivist did not care for that word. It printed a map like frost across Admiral Chen's retina, names leaning into names, signatures forged out of routine, patterns that claimed innocence by being common, but patterns that common do not converge so precisely by accident. At 11:38, Ambassador Vasquez requested the Council's emergency chamber. At 11:01, the Council's emergency chamber requested more time. At 10:59, Admiral Chen stopped asking. Earth's delegation moved as a single organism. The security chorus took the hall's bones into custody. The med lattice's petals sealed around the president and hardened into something that was very old, a coffin. The coffin rose not toward any door, but toward the center of the ceiling. The Orion Hall had never imagined needing a funeral vector. Earth had brought one anyway. It locked into the architecture as if it had always belonged there because the 4th principle of peace is preparation for when peace fails. When the coffin arrived at the apex, it vanished into the station's central ring. The ring turned once, slowly, and every translator in every delegate's ear skipped a beat to remind them that even machines grieve. 72 hours, Vasquez repeated, voice steady now. This summit is adjourned to the chambers of investigation. Earth will not negotiate under crosshairs. To the Viurk's dominion, do not offer condolences where accountability is required. The Viurk's envoy did not blink. Empires are taught early that blinking is concession. Ambassador, he said softly as if he were generous. Let's not assume. I don't assume, Excellency, Vasquez said. I compute. 720000. The clock kept time. The doctrine has a name in our books, dry as winter wood. Lex Terran, Retaliation, Clause 7, the 72. It is not theater. It is not a threat we hope to never use. It is arithmetic. You subtract the assassin's certainty from the victim's life and repay the difference in structure. At hour 0, the archivist stopped being a watcher and became a witness. Its testimony was admissible across 300 jurisdictions because we had insisted on the common chain, a shared forensic ledger that every civilization hated at first, and then discovered it could not breathe politics without. 6 signatures from 6 civilizations lit green. The 7th, Viurks, pulsed amber. At hour 0:16, Ambassador Vasquez addressed the emergency chamber via a frame of light that pretended to be wood. We will submit every shred of our evidence to the chain, she said. You will all have it within the hour. We request, in parallel, provisional custody of the following Viurks nationals. She listed names with the calm cadence of liturgy. We request a freeze of the following accounts. More names, but these were entities. Their edges were softer and thus more dangerous. We request runtime access to the following firmware keys. You request much, the council chair observed, as people with gavels have always observed when history asks them to do their jobs. We request exactly what the charter provides, Vasquez said, and what the charter never imagined we would need this soon. At hour 0:24, the archivist did what machines with purpose do when presented with doubt. It opened itself. Not the algorithmic arteries that predators could poison, not the code that peddlers could sell, but the inputs and outputs, the chain of custody, the discrete steps that no one could reduce further. Witness, affirmation, aggregate, infer, prove or do not prove, it blurred nothing, it delighted no one. At hour 1:03, the Dominion counter-narrative crystallized, a fringe cell. Rogue engineers forged accounts, a conspiracy designed to implicate polite power. The council called it plausible. Plausible is the anesthetic of institutions. Earth's lawyers nodded. They had predicted the word and written the antidote in advance. At hour 1:12, Admiral Chen did something all the journals later called rash and she maintained was merely honest. She pushed the doctrine's second key. Around the Vyerk's dominion, in systems where Vyerk stars blazed like entitled gods, navigation floated a degree out of true. Unimportant in civilian life. Disastrous in logistics. Ships live on knives, on edges of delta V, margins of heat, minutes of miscalculation. We shaved those margins and returned them as a debt. No ship crashed. That would have been theater. But ports closed of their own accord because ports prefer harmless boredom to scandal. Black markets looked up from their morbid novels and found that every tongue of gossip knew their names now, so they closed their mouths and their shutters. The Vyerk's grain fleets slowed to a stately crawl. The Vyerk's treasury opened its mouth to yawn and discovered that money only breathes when the ledgers agree to remember it. At hour 1:47, the Dominion called it piracy. Ambassador Vasquez called it escrow. At hour 2:00, Earth published the Orion instrument, a legal document worked in languages and in silences. It stated the terms the universe could live with. Deliver the architects of the president's murder to the council within 6 hours. Pledge the instrumentality, the devices, contracts, algorithms by which the murder had been made possible. Place the following 6 ministries under external audit. If the Dominion complied, Earth would lift the instruments of disassembly. If not, Earth would not target civilians, nor planets, nor even ships. We would target the Empire. What does that mean? A minor pundit from a minor world dared to ask. It means we will remove the relationships that make an empire, Admiral Chen said, and her voice was gentle because gentleness is the last mercy before a structure breaks. At hour 3:18, the Dominion delivered 4 men who smelled of fear and 4 women who smelled of overconfidence. The chain recorded them with perfect politeness. At hour 3:22, the Dominion declared this sufficient. At hour 3:23, the archivist posted the 10th path. The one that had not appeared until the 9th was admitted. A maintenance update to a pacemaker chip that had no publicly documented maintenance mode. A private key that had never been exported. A routing algorithm that had only ever lived inside a particular ministry's air-gapped room. The room's airflow pattern, reconstructed from dust motes on a delegate's sleeve, told the archivist who had stood where and which way they had sneezed. At hour 4:00, Admiral Chen pressed the 3rd key. Across Vyerk's space, the Concord net woke. It was no weapon. It was an old humanitarian device built from an ugly catalog of emergencies, famines, plagues, sudden wars, refugees. It delivered aid by creating corridors where none existed. Now it inverted its mission. It created corridors that did exist and then made them one way, out of imperial control, into the chain's care. Ships carrying food and medicine were invited forward. Warships were asked to wait. Ports that chose to honor the instrument watched their ledgers clear and their skies grow full of helpful hulls. Ports that did not discovered what happens when you are very large and suddenly very alone. At hour 5:12, the Dominion's envoy asked for time, for context, for an explanation that would make a cruelty seem less cruel. This escalates beyond proportion, he murmured. A proportion is a ratio of 2 like quantities, Ambassador Vasquez replied. You're confusing proportion with embarrassment. At hour 6:00, the Dominion had delivered bodies and tears. It had not delivered the keys. The clock, polite as a guillotine, rolled on. When humanity names a doctrine, we don't choose good names. The 72 was named by a committee in a room with bad coffee and good air filters. The engineers later joked that they should have called it the Vanishing. Historians shook their heads. Historians don't like jokes that will make sense too soon. At hour 6:01, we began to subtract. Subtraction is not always removing mass. Sometimes it is removing attention. The archivist bought the attention of every honest ship mind and rented the indifference of every crooked one. Traffic lights in space are not colors. They are probabilities. We turned every green to maybe and every maybe to no for anything that reported a Vyerk's imperial nexus. At hour 7:30, the gatekeeper array, the old, cautious ring of human-built transit relays that held our side of the Orion corridor, rolled its shoulders and adjusted its alignment. It wasn't a blockade. We do not blockade food and medicine. It was a vector favoring humanitarian freight and disfavoring imperial requisitions. The mathematics were simple. If your cargo documented a destination that existed on the Concord Net's whitelist, you gained time. If your cargo smelled like an internal security deployment, you lost it. If you tried to lie, the chain felt you lie and returned your packet to sender with a polite citation and an impolite delay. The Dominion called it war by bureaucracy. We called it the civilizing of force. At hour 9, the quiet choir sang. The choir is not literal music. It is the synchronization of 1,000 small systems dramatized in our own minds as harmony because humans like stories where parts become wholes. The choir notified every Vyerk subject world that Earth would honor any legal secession filed within the next 27 hours under the Charter's emergency provisions. It instructed the chain to treat any planetary legislature, city council, labor union, temple board, or student senate as a candidate sovereign if they could assemble quorum in public and put their names to a document. An empire is large because it declares other kinds of largeness illegal. The choir invited largeness back. At hour 12, the Vyerk's treasury discovered that currencies are thin lies over thick trust. The Ledger Zero instrument, dry words for a holy thing, set every transaction touching certain accounts to require consensus from neutral validators. The validators were old enemies and recent friends and boring clerks and a cluster of cathedral AIs that took pride in being too pious to lie. The money did not freeze. It merely slowed to the speed of honesty. Empires cannot metabolize honesty at scale. At hour 15, a Vyerk's destroyer group escorted a relief convoy toward a restive moon. The Concord Net refused their transponder handshake with the sorts of phrases adults reserve for children who are not listening. You are welcome with the convoy, or you are welcome to follow behind it. You are not welcome in front of it. The destroyers fired a legal brief. The Net returned a physics one, localized field drag that gently, inexorably pulled the warships 1,000 kilometers astern. No scorch marks, no debris, no heroics, just iron patience. At hour 18, the first secession votes came in, not grand parliaments. A fishing syndicate in the Azure Archipelagos, a college on a hill where the student senate discovered it had more backbone than the faculty. A guild of water engineers tired of being requisitioned into building monuments to mediocre ministers. The chain certified each vote as fast as ethics allowed. The votes traveled like pressure through a sealed system. Somewhere far from Orion, a governor's niece did the math and called her aunt. The aunt had unlearned fear long ago. One of the Empire's errors had been to underestimate ants. At hour 21, the Dominion tried something clever. It broadcast the personal data of every human diplomat in Vyerk space and offered amnesty for any accidental harm that might fall upon them. The broadcast made a certain kind of man smirk at a certain kind of bar. At hour 21:06, the archivist published the names and assets of the men at the bar. At hour 21:07, those men developed an interest in social work. The Concord Net sent them pamphlets. At hour 24, the custodian, the oldest of our AIs, though it never brags, rolled out the Protean proxy, a voluntary opt-in identity veil for citizen groups on seceding worlds. Using banal tools we had built for long-distance classrooms and domestic violence shelters, it sheltered the newborn sovereignties long enough for their first breaths. This is what empires call subversion and we call prenatal care. Somewhere around hour 27, exhausted ministers in the Vyerk's capital held a meeting that still smells of stale tea and panic across 100 reconstructions. "We can weather this," one of them said. "They won't pull the next lever." At hour 30, Admiral Chen pulled it. The Herald fleet decloaked, not in the old way of ghosts and shadows, but in the new way of paperwork made manifest. Each Herald ship, sleek plates and patient engines, carried a charter printer, a device that could deploy a physically unseizable, legally ungameable copy of the charter on any world. When the Heralds arrived in orbit, they printed law like rain. Not human law. The law we had all written together and then conveniently forgot when it embarrassed us. Streets read it. Basements read it. Marines read it and took off their helmets. At hour 33, the first Vyerk's capital ship mutinied. Not out of love for humans, out of love for a chance to tell the truth and not be shot for it. The chain caught the mutiny in its net and declared the ship neutral under the charter's asylum clause. The Dominion howled. The Dominion had been howling so long no one could tell when it meant it anymore. At hour 36, the Dominion still looked large on star maps, but in the quiet mechanical maps underneath, the torque of logistics, the hum of ledgers, the fragile isotopes of morale, the Dominion had already begun to disappear. Empires do not die like men. They do not clutch their chests and fall. They go on speaking long after their tongues have been weighed and found wanting. They persist in letterhead and in flags, in mindless procedures and in terrified habits. Killing an empire is an act for butchers. We are engineers. We unmake. At hour 37, the archivist released the provenance map, a web of cause and cost connecting every Vyerk's monument to the village it had starved, every palace corridor to the clinic it had closed. The map did not order vengeance. It ordered refunds. For every extracted resource, a schedule of restitution. For every stolen vote, a schedule of elections with the names of the people whose signatures had been forged and the addresses of the rooms where the forging had happened. At hour 40, the Dominion declared the map fabricated. At hour 40:01, the Council's own auditors verified 3 random threads. It took them 9 minutes to find blood under nails. At hour 42, the gatekeeper array executed a maneuver so elegant that poetry will keep stealing credit for it. It re-indexed every Orion side address for Vyerk's military gates, sliding them a fraction off the grooves they had worn into the night. No boom, no rift, just misalignment like a door whose hinges had aged by an hour. War fleets could still move, they just had to move honestly through public corridors under public law. The Empire's private roads were gone. At hour 45, the Dominion tried to buy a miracle. Miracles were not for sale. Miracles had been unionized. At hour 48, Earth spoke with the one voice everyone had been waiting to hear, the voice that stops. "We will not target your homes," Ambassador Vasquez said. "We will not sink your ships. We will not salt your fields. We will not humiliate your soldiers. We will dismantle the apparatus that lets one city own another. We will end the fiction that your ministries are inevitable." At hour 50, the unseen registry bloomed. Technically, it was a set of declarations of non-recognition recorded by enough powers to matter. Culturally, it was a banishment ritual, a promise not to remember the Empire as a single thing. Maps redrew themselves as if embarrassed, not a stroke of the pen, a shrug. The registry did nothing to planets, to children, to gardens. It did everything to the contracts that made an admiral believe a farmer owed him his heir. At hour 53, the Dominion broadcast footage of burning archives and called it proof of Earth's barbarism. The archivist responded with backups printed in monasteries and marketplaces, on paper and on stone, in graffiti and in lullabies. We learned a very long time ago to store our gods and our laws in mouths. The Dominion's flames licked the air and died of boredom. At hour 56, the custodian invoked the refusal. It is the dullest word for the brightest act. A massive, coordinated, multi-civilizational refusal by civil service networks to process imperial directives that contradicted the charter. Clerks are underestimated by emperors for the same reason oceans are underestimated by birds. At hour 59, the Vyerk's capital's air tasted of tin. In the palace, a minister shouted about treason to a staff that had discovered it was allowed to go home. Outside, citizens gathered for the first legal assembly their grandmothers had described but never seen. A child asked her mother why the banners looked tired. "Because they are," the mother said, and the words sounded like a prayer. At hour 60, Admiral Chen addressed the Dominion Navy's general channel. Her hair was uncombed, her uniform was wrinkled. She looked like an engineer at 3 a.m. "You are not our enemy," she said. "The machine that uses you is. Set your weapons to safeties. Declare neutral. We will shepherd you to ports where no one will make you choose between honor and hunger." At hour 62, 37 ships complied. At hour 63, 104. At hour 64, a Vyerk's dreadnought tried to fire on a herald ship and discovered that firing mechanisms are cowardly if you speak to them kindly. The dreadnought's gun captain cried very quietly in the privacy of a trigger that decided to be a flower. At hour 66, the council chair, aging visibly in the brutal light of public remembrance, asked Ambassador Vasquez if Earth would consider moderating its measures in exchange for a promise. "Promises are the rope with which we've all hanged ourselves," Vasquez said, not unkindly. "We will moderate when the structure moderates. We will stop when the machine stops." At hour 69, the Vyerk's regent, neither stupid nor brave, which is the worst combination, attempted a speech about continuity. His teleprompter fed him prose written by men who read too much of themselves and not enough of maps. Midway through a sentence whose grammar had been tortured to make power sound gentle, the feeds quietly recontextualized him. Under his face, the provenance map traced lines from his childhood trust fund to the manufacturing defect in Miriam Solace's pacemaker. He stopped speaking the way a machine stops, between syllables, surprised at the mercy of interruption. At hour 70, the regent sent a message no one would admit existed. It contained names. It contained keys. It contained a word empires use only when language has become honest: dissolution. At hour 71, the Dominion's flag came down on the central spire of a city designed to be photographed from angles that disguised its emptiness. The flag did not fall. It was folded slowly by caretakers who had decided to remain caretakers on behalf of someone else. At hour 72, the council's bell rang. Metal struck in a tower that humans had helped rebuild from shards when the tower had housed a different bell and a more cheerful lie. The chair spoke into a room that had learned how to listen. "The entity known as the Vyerk's Dominion no longer meets the criteria for recognition," she said. "Its constituent worlds are sovereign pending their choice of federation. Its officers are subject to the charter. Its ministries are subject to audit. Its crimes are subject to memory. An empire did not explode. It did not burn. It was not conquered. It ceased to be an it." Admiral Chen exhaled the breath she had been holding for 3 days. Ambassador Vasquez turned off her microphone. The archivist dimmed its lights and waited for someone to ask it a better question. Above an amber gas giant in a hall where a woman had died for being brave in front of cowards, the air became heavier and more possible. "You started the clock," Chen had said. 72 hours later, the clock stopped. It had measured not the length of our anger, but the patience of our engineering. In the silence that followed history finishing a sentence, The station's gravitic ribs gave a small, creaking sigh, the sound buildings make when they agree with people. And somewhere far from Orion, in a listening post older than our language for oceans, something that had once been called a god and then called a myth and then called a glitch opened its eyes. It had opinions about empires and about clocks. It had opinions about us. The clock stopped. The noise didn't. Orion Station breathed like a body after sprinting, shallow, uncertain, unwilling to believe the finish line is real. The glass cathedral was no longer a crime scene. It was a place where people still looked up without meaning to, as if the coffin might return by reversing a vector and a wish. Crews replaced the gold leaf filigree where heat lattices had sealed and unsealed, but one pane of glass in the central arch stayed slightly misted. A superstition took root within the hour. No one wiped that pane. Engineers do not often keep superstitions, they keep tolerances. Still, they left the mist. Admiral Sarah Chen did not attend the public vigil. She stood instead in a maintenance corridor 3 decks below the hall, where the station's ribs met a column of gravity and heat. Pipelines whispered to her like old colleagues. In her hand lay a small slate, a letter Miriam Solace had scheduled with the custodian to be delivered in the event of biological cessation during any summit. Miriam considered her own death one of the station's possible failure modes. The slate recognized Chen's print and unlocked. No rhetoric, no final order, 3 sentences, each written like a bolt torqued to spec. Sarah, if they take me measure, if you must burn something, burn a machine. When the hour is done, return the sky to whoever can love it next. Chen closed the slate. In her chest, something like grief returned to room temperature. Then she climbed toward work. Earth's delegation did what grieving humans do when they choose not to howl, they built. The first structure went up on Deck 12 in a space once reserved for minor receptions and a triumphant exhibit of edible orchids. The orchids moved aside. In their place rose the provenance office, half courtroom, half audit lab, half neighborhood help desk. The math of halves broke, the room held. Here harmed worlds could bring receipts and be believed. Here the archivist would sit in the witness box, not as a god, but as a ledger that knew how to speak in public. Here, anyone who had oiled the gears of plausible deniability could enter and exchange their knowledge for a future that did not end at a gallows. Ambassador Elena Vasquez opened the door, literally. She insisted there be an actual door you could knock on, not a portal keyed to titles or implants. She wore black, not for theatrics, but because black hides coffee. This is not Victor's justice, she told the first gathered crowd. This is repair. The galaxy cannot learn to breathe if the lungs are left punctured. If you helped puncture them, come in and confess. We will bind your hands to work, not to chains. Unions, temples, neighborhood councils, old women with sharper memories than their governments, people arrived. They brought paper. The sight of paper in a hall of light had a sacramental force. A fisherman from the Azure archipelagos laid down a laminated chart blotched with salt. Quotas raised without votes. Inspectors bribed by a minister's aide whose signature matched a scholarship form on the provenance map. A monk placed a brass key on the desk and asked if anyone remembered what it opened. The archivist remembered. Behind the monk's left ear, a hearing implant chirped with gratitude. The Vierks delegation, or what remained of it, filed a protest. Their lawyers argued that Earth had exceeded the Charter's intent by creating a tribunal de facto. Intent shrivels when separated from consequence, Vasquez replied. The Charter measures consequence. She gestured toward a wall where numbers recalculated themselves with the merciless softness of rain. Calories diverted from clinics, oxygen debt measured in hours, lives stolen via silent algorithm. The wall did not blink. By midday, the Orion Ordinance had 47 co-signatories beyond Earth, small polities with names few reporters knew how to pronounce. They pledged auditors, social workers, mediators, container ships retrofitted for housing. The Concord Net created law lanes, corridors that prioritized traffic bound for repair posts. A chorus of translators agreed on new words for very old labor. making straight, returning weight unharming. No one pretended the words would behave. They had the right direction. Children began arriving. That surprised everyone and then embarrassed no one. Children carry receipts adults forgot how to keep. A girl from a rail yard colony stood at the provenance desk and said, "My father can tell you where the trains really go when the screens say relief." Her father tried to hush her. The auditors gave them both tea. The archivist asked for directions. It printed a map and folded it into a paper crane. The girl put it in her pocket. Outside, the Herald fleet remained in high, courteous orbit above worlds whose flags woke as if from concussion. Herald ships did not strut. They practiced presence. In their bellies, charter printers thumped like honest hearts. On their hulls, painters from 10 worlds lettered articles in scripts that made even machine vision work a little harder and thus a little more carefully. Starfighters stayed holstered, not out of naivete, but by design. War, after all, was not the doctrine. Subtraction was. In the evening, a delegation from the Vyerk's medical ministry requested entry with raised hands. Their leader, a woman named Asura, brought a box of pacemakers in their original packaging. "We made these," she said quietly. "We thought we were making mercy. We were paid well. The firmware keys were never ours." She set the box down and asked for a job. The provenance clerks gave her one, identifying every device her ministry had made that could be whispered into becoming a weapon. It is one of history's quieter mercies that some of the loudest crimes are repaired by the same hands that committed them. Admiral Chen visited the office late when the station lights had dimmed to an honest hum. She read lists until the text ghosted. She signed requisitions for food and for more chairs than any war had ever needed. She asked the custodian for a schedule of life support checks in seceding ports. Finally, she placed Miriam's slate inside the office's cornerstone under the orchid's old drainage pipe. "Burn a machine," Miriam had written. Chen had done that. Now came the harder work, building rooms machines could not rule. Above Orion's amber giant, beacons along the gatekeeper array pulsed a new pattern, a cadence favoring slow ships and tired people. The pattern's nickname spread without anyone deciding it should, the Gentle. Freighters repeated it. Pilots whistled it unconsciously when docking. Somewhere in the choir of life support fans and magnetic brakes, Orion Station learned a lullaby. On the second night, an old longshoreman looked at the misted pane and finally wiped it with his sleeve. The spot cleared, then fogged again with his breath. He laughed, a rough, surprised sound, and left the smudge there on purpose. Later, tourists would come and press their own breaths to the same glass, and the guards would pretend not to see. Grief, too, needs a place to condense and evaporate over and over until it becomes weather rather than storm. The clock had measured our restraint and our resolve. The hours after began to measure something rarer, whether a civilization could remain angry at a machine without teaching itself to hate the people who had bolted the machine together. In the provenance office, a sign in plain letters went up over the tea urns. "We repair with you or without you. With you is faster." The urns never ran dry. The council did not love the word trial. Trials imply verdicts, and verdicts imply endings, and institutions prefer processes that can stay processes forever. But the provenance office had compiled so much receipt and testimony that to refuse formal shape would have been a cruelty of its own. A chamber was appointed, not the sonic theater of the main hall, but a lower space circled by wooden galleries that creaked when you leaned too far forward. The acoustics made shouting self-humiliating and listening rewarding. This was deliberate. Architects had conspired with ethicists. The conspiracy pleased everyone who had waited their whole lives to see architecture behave. They called it the provenance trials because naming is a first verdict. What we intended to prove was not guilt alone but lineage, how a crime travels, how a machine assembles itself out of favors and best practices, how deniability is a pyramid scheme that pays until it collapses. The archivist took an oath. It did not place a hand on any book. It displayed in real time the chain from censor to inference to conclusion. Its operators, People with quiet eyes and loud pens swore the human oath to stop the machine if it began to want things. Day one began with something that felt like mercy pretending to be a jolt. A Orcs engineer named Denov admitted to designing the maintenance path inside the pacemaker chips. It was for field updates, he said, voice tired but unbroken. Hospitals in the periphery can't always get a specialist. The path let a clinic wake a chip without surgery. He looked at the box Asura had carried and then at the public gallery, where a child kicked her feet against a bench because that is what children do when history is speaking too slowly. I did not imagine murder with my tool, Denov said. I imagined convenience. Ambassador Vasquez did not insult him by performing outrage. We do not try imaginations here, she said. We try instrumentality. She turned to a wall where the instrumentality tree bloomed. A diagram showing where a tool was designed, who paid for each feature, who wrote each clause permitting each contract, and which audit should have stopped which fork before it happened. The tree made grown men clench their jaws. Reality, when diagrammed without pity, does that. The Dominion's council attempted a counter-story. Rogue financiers infiltrated boards, a foreign capital that spirited keys across borders, a chain with too many human hands to blame any one pair. This was old, rehearsed music. The gallery did not applaud. It watched the archivist pull a thread Denov had perhaps never seen. A non-profit set up to subsidize pacemaker upgrades in secessionist districts, but only if the devices were sourced from one subcontractor in New Kowloon. The non-profit's treasurer was the niece of a minister whose voting record, when overlaid on the provenance map, described a polygon that included every clinic whose inventory later vanished. It is possible to commit murder using only paperwork, the presiding adjudicator observed, voice thin but sharp as icing. Our parents warned us of this. We wrote it into the charter and called it Dominion by form. We forgot our own warning. She tapped the bench. Wood answered with a small, satisfying note. The question before us is whether we can design forms that refuse to become murderers. So they wrote, there live while the gallery held its breath, the Orion standard of instrumentality. It did not pretend to outlaw malice. Laws never have. It outlawed convenience in chains of custody that touched bodies, brains, breath. To build a device capable of remote activation now required an opposition key, a key held by a diverse quorum of people whose incentives were provably misaligned with the device's owner. The quorum rotated like crops. The key's use was recorded on the chain, not with the user's name, but with a mathematical witness that could be subpoenaed like any clerk. This was not theater. This was torque. From the galleries came a murmuring like tide in a stone-cut bay. Unions that controlled the periphery's repair depots recognized their leverage. So did medical colleges and church elders and the quiet guilds of network librarians who decide, every day, what gets remembered. They filed petitions on the spot. The adjudicator smiled in the way women smile when they have successfully bribed the future with better habits. Afternoons belonged to survivors. No two told the same story, which was how you knew the stories were true. A nurse described silencing an alarm because the alarm had become so clever at crying wolf that it cried wolf while wolves walked in. A shipwright testified to a standard cost optimization that removed a physical switch from an engine room control bank because software could do it faster. When asked how often the software had been honest, he held up a scar and said, "Enough for us to keep our jobs." The room believed him and did not allow his resignation to become absolution. Earth did not stand alone at the lectern. A mason from the Federation of Bridges explained how her union would now require bridges to bear the names of the villages they connected, not the ministers who cut the ribbons. This made ribbon cutting difficult to monetize as murder. A monk proposed that monasteries resume an old practice, speaking every law allowed on market days so that memory could not be bought by those who owned the servers. A child, the same one who had swung her feet, asked if the chain could remember smells. The archivist admitted that it was learning. Evenings belonged to arguments we had been too tired to have while empires spoke loudly. A philosopher in a sweater older than the station said the word justice until it sounded like a tool that needed sharpening. A captain with a medal he'd always hidden under his shirt admitted he had almost ordered fire during the 72 and had not because a line of code blushed at him. "Do we want blushing machines?" the adjudicator asked. "We want measured machines," Vasquez replied. "We will keep the blushing for ourselves." On the 7th day, the adjudicator read the first continuity writ. It dissolved 3 Viarch's ministries, not with triumph but with a plain statement of boring facts. Their functions could be performed by smaller, federated offices with opposition keys and rotating auditors and feeds that required a human voice to proceed at each critical junction. No burst of light, no cheering, just the disciplined ending of a mistake and the disciplined beginning of a habit. Flags do not like this kind of ending. People learn to. When the session adjourned, Admiral Chen stood on a balcony and watched tugboats push a herald into a safer berth, as if it were an elderly aunt who did not like to ask for help. Elena Vasquez joined her with 2 paper cups that tasted of overboiled tea and victory deferred. "We are building molasses," Elena said. "Yes," Chen answered. "May it gum every bad wheel." They drank. Below them, the provenance office refilled its tea urns. Above them, a point of light moved wrong. Chen noticed the wrongness the way a violinist hears a single note that isn't in the chord. She lifted her wrist. "Gatekeeper," she said softly, "query anomaly." The reply arrived with the politeness of a machine that knows how to say "please forgive me" before delivering bad news. A ship was coming. Its name was not in any registry that mattered. Its transponder smelled like a forgery built by a romantic. Its vector pointed not at a port but at a crowd. Even just societies must rehearse emergency. The balcony lights dimmed to let the stars have their say. Somewhere far behind those stars lay a winter without clocks. Somewhere just ahead of them, a remnant rehearsed a suicide and called it proof of loyalty. Admiral Chen set down her tea and reached for the lever every engineer keeps next to her heart. The one that opens, the one that closes, the one that gives a path a gentler slope. The trials would continue tomorrow. Tonight, someone who had not learned anything in 72 hours wanted to teach the galaxy that learning is weakness. We arranged an answer that felt like learning. They called themselves the Pale Crown because men who love crowns tend to imagine that naming a thing can resurrect it. Their ships had lain quiet behind a dust lane where regulators hate to inspect because dust gets in the joints of everything, including consciences. The Pale Crown's doctrine was uncomplicated. Strike something soft and public. Orion's provenance Q, a herald printing law over a refinery world, a field hospital that made comfort more contagious than fear, and broadcast panic framed as prophecy. Behold, without the Dominion, chaos. The Dominion, having ceased to be in it, still knew how to throw a ghost's punch. The anomaly gatekeeper flagged resolved into 3 hulls in close formation, and a 4th tucked behind them like a cowardly thought. The 4th carried a mass pattern the archivist labeled without emoticon as unacceptable, a cascade coil that wanted to become a sun at the wrong time and size. Even murderers believe themselves romantic when they draw their names in fire. The coil promised letters no one would forget. Admiral Chen did not scramble fighters. She did not light the big guns and demand a wide shot of justice. Orion had too much glass, too many lungs. She opened the quiet choir to a frequency the choir had not yet sung upon, the emergency voice that speaks to intent before it speaks to metal. Across the array, lights dimmed not in fear but in focus. The Concorde net threw its weight forward, not to block but to reframe. The Pale Crown's approach vector lengthened, as if the station had taken a step back without moving. On deck 12, the provenance Q turned as one organism at the sudden hush in the air. The hush was the kind manufactured by big rooms learning to listen to systems. A clerk put a finger on a list and said to herself, "Not now." A child stopped swinging her feet. "Herald 3, Chen said. "Announce refusal." Herald 3's captain, a woman from a river world where floods vote annually, clicked on an open channel and spoke in a voice that had never once trembled on a radio. "Pale crown vessels, you are in a corridor governed by the charter. You are carrying a device your mothers would not bless. We refuse your intention. We have tea and medical staff if this was a mistake. If it was not a mistake, we have patience, and patience is heavier than your coil." The pale crown laughed. Comedy has always been weaker than patience in rooms where children are present. They dropped their speed to lure pursuit. None came. Their transponders spat scripture about righteous flame and cleansing proof. The archivist fed the scripture into a compost heap of language models trained on 1,000,000 bad manifestos and returned fertilizer. Words sprouted in places propaganda hates. Comment sections on local channels, prayer walls, unions' night schools. We have seen this trick. We are bored of it. Boredom, civilization's meanest, most effective antibody, spread. But boredom alone would not diffuse a coil shaped like a promise. On the gatekeeper's spines, thousands of coil-savvy minds who had once dreamed of making suns smaller and safer began to hum math. They grew the gentle into a field the size of regret. The field did not hit the pale crown's ships. It gave them a slope. Engines that craved drama found themselves persuaded toward procedure. Safeties woke. Valves remembered the reasons they had been invented. Control rods practicing retirement raised their hands for one last shift. Inside the suicide ship, a gunner with a scar on her knuckle watched her status board swap red for amber for green with the offended astonishment of someone who had prepared to be a martyr and been offered honest work instead. The Pale Crown's commander did what commanders do when the universe fails to honor their narrative. He ordered fire. The first shot went sideways, not by sabotage, but by physics that had remembered its oath. A rail slug that wanted to be tragedy whispered past a buoy, kissed a beacon, and split itself into a harmless script that spelled the word no in 37 languages and one railway code. The station's crowd laughed, tired and then real. A second shot tried to obey. The Protean proxy caught it and wore it until it exhaled. The proxy is not armor. It is a question mark you drape over a blow. The shot could not find a self to puncture. It chose a wall, discovered the wall had been fabricated by a guild that still carved saints into load-bearing columns for luck, and decided to be a dent. The fourth ship, the cowardly thought, kept trying to make its coil into a hymn. Its captain's hands shook. The archivist smelled salt and old cigarettes, and a letter stuck under a bunk mattress with the kind of tape that wants to teach you about impermanence. It sent the ant network, women with clipboards and terrible patience, into the captain's ear via public channel. Honey, an ant's voice said, the way a universe speaks when it refuses to be impressed. Turn the key off. That coil isn't your confession, it's your employer's. We have soup, we have lawyers, we have work that won't make your grandmother spit. Silence, then another silence, thinner, then a click. The field felt a mass remember it was not obligated to be dramatic. The coil powered down, not with a hiss, but with a long, wet breath like rain caught by a window screen. The ship drifted. The Concorde net caught it on the third try, which was good for morale because it taught everyone that heroism often requires do-overs. The other three ships discovered that their narrative had developed static. One tried to ram. The gatekeeper array excused itself from politeness and raised drag to 99%. You can push through such drag with war gods and good PR. You cannot push through it with engines maintained by junior technicians who have been paid in slogans. The ramming failed like a speech whose nouns refused to agree with its verbs. Admiral Chen gave the order she had not wanted to give, and it was still not the order Pale Crown had hoped to harvest. Bored with tethers. Marines in suits that looked like theology lessons latched on with lines, not hooks. On the hull, they painted circles that said this door is now a door where locks had insisted doors were illusions. Inside, they found people, not archetypes. Some threw punches, some threw up. One wept while trying to recite a piece of rhetoric he had misremembered on purpose so it would end quicker. Tethers brought them out. Medics took them. Lawyers took notes. A herald printed the charter on the deck of the suicide ship, and a sailor sat on the preamble without meaning to and apologized to the words like they were an ant. The words did not mind. They had been sat on before. On deck 12, the trials paused. The adjudicator looked over her glasses and told the gallery to stretch their legs. Elena Vasquez brewed fresh tea and stole a breath on the balcony where a week earlier she had watched the anomaly announce itself like a cough. Chen joined her, hair pinned with the kind of clip that knows it's working overtime. "They'll try again," Elena said. "Of course," Chen said, "but not with coils. Coils have lost their glamour. What will they try with?" "History," Chen answered. "They'll try to explain the past in a way that makes relapse sound like rescue." Below, tugboats towed the pale crown ships into pens labeled with small, embarrassing words. Intake, paperwork, detox. The archivist logged 1,000 small kindnesses and 100 small cruelties, and refused to be poetic about either. On a world that had voted itself sovereign at hour 33, a bar opened with a sign that read "No Remnants," and next door a soup kitchen opened with a sign that read "YES Remnants," and between them a school posted, "We take your kids, feed them, and send them back with homework." Civilization is nothing but such triangulations, repeated until boredom makes them feel natural. That night, the stars above Orion seemed closer. This was not metaphysics. The station had recalibrated its curvature harmonics by an imperceptible margin to ease docking for damaged ships. But pilots swear the stars leaned in to eavesdrop. On a band of static the human ear cannot hear, something old cleared its throat. The trials resumed at dawn. The gallery carried the smell of soup. It announced itself with etiquette older than maps, not with a beacon or a burst, but with a shadow that did not correspond to any object. The astronomers, bless them, tried to be new about it and failed. They described the phenomenon as a negative luminosity event, and then in the same breath as a visitor. The geometry resembled the shape of a city that had been erased along axes we do not normally measure. The custodian looked up from a spreadsheet and whispered, "Oh." Admiral Chen, who trusts old machines when they say "oh" in the tone of someone seeing a childhood teacher, authorized a channel no one liked to admit existed. Hospitality to the uncatalogued. The herald stood to with formal slowness, the way you stand when an elder enters a room and you aren't sure which tradition deserves respect. Elena Vasquez switched from tea to water without thinking and straightened the stack of petitions on her desk that had haunted her sleep since she was 22. The shadow did not become a ship. It became a continuity of permission. Space around Orion learned, for a polite span, how to permit impossible shapes to coexist politely with possible ones. What arrived stepped over no laws. It asked the laws to remember their youth. The archivist produced an index card history class had never offered us because the curriculum had considered us too excitable. The orthotrope, called by older, poorer names on worlds that do not get invited to galas. An entity system that appears when civilizations stop measuring themselves exclusively by conquest and begin measuring by repair. It is not a god. It wants nothing. It notices. It keeps lists written in stone too soft to be visible to hands that have only learned to grip. The orthotrope spoke in the oldest way, by allowing us to overhear ourselves. On every channel that mattered, voices arranged themselves into a braid and found that the braid made a word. Engineers, it said, because that is the title it gives to species when they choose subtraction over spectacle. Your clock was not a bomb. Your clock was a level. It measures flatness. You have used it to flatten an arrogance that had made air incline toward a few lungs. We record this. None of the cameras could find a face. Faces are less useful than lists at such hours. Still, the human brain prefers a vantage. A child, the same tireless one, asked her aunt, "Is it nice?" The aunt considered seriously. It is accurate, she said. Nice is for after. Elena Vasquez requested terms because courtesies are our best defense against the sublime. Do you come to judge our trials? She asked. We come to count what you have chosen to count, the orthotrope said. Judgment is a human word for a human appetite. We prefer inventory. We keep a sunless archive, a place where empires are remembered as ratios, what they demanded versus what they returned, what they called law versus what they enforced. Your 72 adjusted enumerator most species leave alone. This attracts us. Admiral Chen, who had learned to distrust compliments, asked for the knife inside the velvet. What do you want us to do? She said. Inventory, the orthotrope replied. Beyond Orion lies a knot of contracts older than Vierks, older than your charter's first apology. It calls itself the triune market when it wants to smile and the continuity when it wants to hiss. It teaches worlds that alertness to repair is weakness. It prefers clocks that run backward. We do not arrest it. We do not fight. We invite inventory. We invite you. The room thought a single thought the way schools of fish turn without appointing a choreographer, trap. The orthotrope heard the thought and approved. Healthy, it said. Bring your provenance, bring your ant network, bring your heralds, bring your gatekeepers, bring your boredom. It said the last word with something dangerously close to tenderness. Where we are going, boredom will be your only armor. The council chair, to her credit, asked a question that made the galleries sigh with relief. Under whose authority? She said. The orthotrope replied with the only answer that would not insult us. Under yours, it said. You may decline. Invitation is an art we still practice. If you accept, you will not be absorbed. You will be watched. This is what societies do to one another when they are brave. Elena Vasquez turned her face toward Admiral Chen and found in the Admiral's eyes the precise slope tomorrows should ride down. We will not go as supplicants, Elena said. We will go as auditors. Chen nodded. We will go as repair crews. The orthotrope made a sound like chalk refusing to squeal against a board. Correct, it said. Bring tea. On Orion, preparations began with the same humble instruments that had dismantled an empire. Not fleets first, but forms, public drafts of the Orion Compact for inventoried travel, specifying opposition keys for any device that might whisper at a heartbeat, witness channels for any negotiation, and a banal but vicious clause requiring that any meeting be transcribed first for the deaf and second for machines. Heralds reconfigured their printers to produce contracts in octagonal format because octagons make lawyers pause and pauses save lives. News of the invitation leaked precisely as much as the ant network allowed. On a dozen worlds, boys with new haircuts bragged in bars about shipping out to meet the shadow. Their boasting gave jobs to tailors and therapists and the sober friends who walk young men to docks. On 3 worlds, preachers declared the orthotrope a demon. On 5, they declared it a mirror. On Earth, a hardware store in a city that used to flood sold out of notebooks, because people remember to write with their hands when the future uses the word inventory. The Pale Crown tried a last small tantrum, leaflets accusing the trials of theater, printed on pulp that stained fingers, thrown from a shuttle whose pilot did not have the right permits. The leaflets clogged a drain near the provenance office. A janitor, title, engineer of cleanliness, unclogged the drain, took 1 leaflet home, and used the back to draft a budget for his daughter's school's welding program. The universe applauded in the way it prefers, by letting the budget be approved without fuss. Departure day came without a fanfare because fanfares confuse instruments. The delegation gathered not on a grand dock, but at a working pier that smelled of oil and good maintenance. Admiral Chen wore the same wrinkled uniform as our 60. Elena Vasquez carried a bag with more pens than any sane person could need. The child with the restless feet had, without anyone authorizing it, been appointed bearer of questions by the provenance clerks, and handed a notebook whose first page read in block letters, "Ask about what we forgot to ask about." The ant network had filled the following 40 pages with suggestions. The orthotrope did not manifest a gangway. It widened the idea of door until the pier's railings admitted they had been snobs. The first step felt like the station exhaling and then remembering that breath belongs to everyone. The provenance clerks cried, not messy, not dignified, just honest. The gatekeeper array rotated its spines by a degree that meant we will be here when you come back. The heralds printed one last charter and laminated it because lamination is a sacrament of stubborn people. Before she stepped through, Admiral Chen returned to the maintenance corridor where the ribs met gravity and heat. She pressed Miriam Solace's slate, now dulled by handling, against a bulkhead and spoke softly. "We measured," she said. "We burned a machine. We are giving the sky to someone who can love it next." She paused. "We'll bring back better hinges." On the balcony, the adjudicator watched the pier empty and whispered the credo that had carried her from a village with no courthouse to a chamber where law tried to be a good neighbor. "Let the forms hold. Let the people be even heavier." She closed her ledger. The trials recessed. The provenance office brewed more tea. The misted pane fogged, cleared, and fogged again. Somewhere beyond Orion, a market that preferred clocks to run backward adjusted its smile by a millimeter and prepared a welcome that smelled like money and amnesia. Somewhere deeper, in the sunless archive, pages made of invisible stone turned themselves to a fresh leaf. Humans who have never been able to resist a difficult invitation walked forward carrying clipboards, questions, and the impolite patience of people who have decided that boredom is a weapon worth mastering. The clock did not start again. We brought a level.